So I was asked to talk about something to do with climate that would pair with Scott's talk and that reflected the contributions of the Computation Institute to climate science. And so I want to give you a sort of summary of a bunch of projects that we have been engaged in as part of something called the Center for Robust Decision-Making on Climate and Energy Policy that is based at the Computation Institute and of which Ian Foster, the head of the Computation Institute, is our main PI. But so because this is kind of a summary of talks of work that's done by many people involved in this project, there's lots of contributors, and I'm just highlighting their names there in no particular order. The ones on the top are people directly at the University of Chicago and Argonne who have been engaged in the work. I'm making the figures that I'm going to show you. And below is all the very large numbers of people who have helped us with computation, either providing models, providing storage, providing transfer. The sort of sum total of most of our runs are done at Argonne on the big hardware up there. Our storage is here at the Research Computing Center. It was at Argonne on pads. We've obviously had the involvement of many, many people to make this possible, and most of the work that I'm going to show you is possible only because of the computational resources available here. That what we are doing is we're leveraging off the fact that we have big computation and skilled computation expertise to do things with climate models that are seen as difficult by other groups. So it really is the leverage of all these many people that's allowing this work to be possible. So before I start talking about what our work is, I want to pause for a minute and tell you about the University of Chicago Center for Robust Decision-Making on Climate and Energy Policy, for those of you who haven't heard about it before. So the proposal of the project is an NSF-funded center, but it arose originally with some interest by the MacArthur Foundation in doing something to do with energy. And they approached Ian and they said, Dr. Foster, do you have any wonderful ideas? We would really like to hear your thoughts on this matter and possibly put in a proposal. And that initiated the process that got everybody together to work and on the projects that eventually became the center. And here are some slides that Ian knows well because he delivered them maybe 5 years ago now, when we were making our first proposal. And I like these slides just because they give a good mission statement. So our original acronym was SIMERTH, which we still use that acronym for some components of our center, a model that produces with community integrated model. I can't remember totally what it is, of the energy and resource trajectories for humanity, I think is what it was. Obviously, we worked hard to make an acronym that came up with something cute. But the idea was that we are going to help decision makers by giving them computational tools that will assist their decisions. So we said SIMERTH will build next generation decision-making tools using state-of-the-art economic and computational methods, and open framework, and global scientific participation. And that still really is our mission statement. So what we told the people at MacArthur and subsequently at NSF is that figuring out what humans will do to the climate is a complicated process that involves understanding not just the Earth system, but people and what they will do, and in turn how they will respond to climate change. And if you don't have both of these systems in place, you can't make an accurate projection. There's no point in making a climate model projection if we don't feed it back to people. You can't figure out what people will do to the climate unless you know how climate change in turn is doing to them. And the problem with this system of systems, as Ian called it, is that the actual level of effort that's gone into understanding the two is very different. There is a big effort on the Earth system right now, as you know, multiple climate models that involve the work of many, many programmers in teams with working groups. Often they're open source teams. One you may have heard of is the Community Climate System Model 3. That is a project that came out of NCAR. It's fully open source, fully community based. You can propose revisions to it, you can propose new modules, and you can set up a working group, and then there'll be a committee that evaluates whether it becomes part of the model code release. So that's just one model. So there's dozens of these models across the world. I think 20 or so are the ones we're using from CPIP 5 now, from the latest archive. The outputs are compared in public inter-comparison projects, and then publicly archived for anyone to download. So you too can compare standardized runs of 20 different climate models around the world just with sufficient patience and clicking on your screen to download all that data. The human system, by comparison, is not modeled particularly well. Models are typically private, the groups are small, there's no standardized comparison efforts. So we said, look, our effort here is going to have two parts. The first part of our goal is we want to have a more complex representation of the human system. We need to make sure that our economic representations and our representations of people's responses to climate change is on par with what we have done with the Earth system, and also incorporates the same standards, which is open source software, public intercomparisons, publicly available data. We want to take the lessons we've learned in climate science and apply them to the modeling of people. Because we think that the computational people who've been working on climate models, we have figured out how to do it. It has to be a communal project. It has to be transparent. It has to be open. So more complex representation of human systems, but at the same time, we're the center for robust decision making on climate and energy policy. We have to have a climate component to this, or else, we're not just a people modeling center. So what are we going to do on climate? And we said, you know what, we don't need to build a new climate model. We don't need to increase the complexity of climate models. Lots and lots of people are already doing this. What we need to do now is synthesize all the information that we have generated from those climate models into some way that the people who are modeling the human side can use more efficiently. So I said, look, all the data is there available for download. But that doesn't mean it's simple and transparent to use it. It's not simple and transparent for someone to use one of these codes to generate new RINs. And it's enormously computationally expensive to run a complex climate model. For the way that people are typically modeling the human system, they need to do optimized iterative runs where you're iterating many, many times over different scenarios. You can't simply do that on several hundred-year runs on a climate system without waiting for several years for your computations to be finished. So we said, okay, fine, our goal is going to be make a less complex representation of the climate system. What can we do to leverage off all the work that people have done in this wonderful, transparent way, and then turn it into something that can be used more simply? So we wanted to have a deliverable, which was an emulation of transient climates. I'll explain what that is in just a minute. And obviously, because we are scientists and care about science, we wanted to have the side benefit of understanding the behavior of climate under changing CO2 forcing from human activity. So I'm going to start with just a reminder of why modeling the climate system is difficult at all. And the reason you can't just run a climate model once and have a one-to-one map of what CO2 is in the atmosphere to what climate comes out the other side is because any change in climate necessarily lags the change in atmospheric forcing that you make. And this is an early version of the slide. We have a much longer run now. This is 4,000 years of a climate model run that was done at Argonne on the CCSM3 Community Climate System Model 3 at relatively low resolution to make it feasible. But even so, we're one of the few groups that routinely does these multi-millennial runs. And why do we do those long runs? Because that's what you have to do in order to see how the climate evolves. So this particular run, the blue here is the CO2 forcing you applied. We ramped it up to 700 ppm, and then magically everybody gets together and has a perfect agreement, and we sort of make the perfect strategy that instantly stabilizes our CO2 at 700 ppm, which is a little bit more than doubling, but slightly under 3 times. And it's fixed forever. No more warming. No more increases in CO2. Like this magic happens. But the climate continues to warm for the next 4,000 years. And you can see that we're not even fully equilibrated at this point. It's still going up. So we've extended this run out now to 9,000 years. And all this is possible, again, only because we have access to Argonne computing. So because there is that lag and that delay between the forcing you apply and the response of the system, you can't just make a one-to-one map. And every single climate projection you make is a function not only of the CO2 at the particular time that you're interested in, but of the history of emissions beforehand. So that has typically led people to say, well, for each new scenario, I need to run the model again, right? Which, if you are trying to do policy analysis, involves an inordinate amount of runs. So even with our big iron at Argonne, and even with running at a lower resolution than people would prefer to have, because everybody's trying to make the models more and more detailed for regional impacts projections, this kind of run will take us a year or so, including the true time. Okay, so we had proposed a tool that we were going to use to make use of the fact that the model is not a chaotic system. There is some behavior which should be relatively predictable. Once you know what the big black box model does, you should be able to use statistics to predict what it would do under a different set of inputs. So we proposed to use a pre-computed library of GCM runs with different CO2 trajectories Then we wanted to train and test a statistical model that relates those CO2 concentrations to the climate model output, to surface temperature and precip, to say, okay, this is just like any sort of system. We're saying here, I put in inputs, I get an output. Now if I put in slightly different inputs, what output would I get? And that way, by making a statistical model, we can produce a tool that captures the response of the full general circulation model, but runs in a fraction of the time that it would take to run the full model. So we're not throwing the big model away. We're saying we need to run the big model in order to know its response. But once we understand how that model behaves, we don't have to run it over and over and over and over again. So the climate modeling has essentially gotten out of, we are now in the situation where we have more data than people are really processing, fully. So we're in the realm where we need to use the tools of statistics because statistics is developed to, make sense out of patterns and big data sets. We're no longer at the case where making a model run is a radically new invention and no one's ever made this projection before. Now we have many projections and we need to make some sense out of what they say collectively. So our proposal was that we would build a library of training runs, and this is some of the kind of training runs that we ran. So you can see we have gradual ramp-ups that then stabilized, and none of these are particularly realistic, but they were designed to kind of elicit the model's behavior. In some ways, we don't necessarily want a realistic scenario. Sometimes we want to push the model in strange ways to see what its response is, right? The more extreme you push it, the more information you have about its response. So some of those, learn number 4, is an abrupt transition. And this little period here is the historical run-up, obviously, that we've mostly initialized with historical run-ups, although we have some that go straight from pre-industrial on up. And then because we want to see whether responses are parallel on the upside and the downside, we do geoengineering runs. We take all the CO2 out of the atmosphere instantly, pull it down. Again, this is a miracle. It would never actually happen. Technologically, it's not even possible. But we're just saying we want to understand the model's behavior. It's a system, and we're trying to understand the model as a system. Our study is the model itself. So because we want to be in the open source world, we use an open source model, this widely used community climate system model 3. It's a fully coupled model with atmosphere, land, ocean, and sea ice. And then the way we get a big library and long runs is we run a low resolution on the big hardware at R1. So a T31 resolution that we're running at is 3.5 degrees by 3.5 degrees. And I'm going to try to have time to show you all the stuff we have done. Now we're doing many studies that involve actually comparing the differences of different resolution. But our initial work was all done at this low resolution because it allows us this very, very ability to do these long runs, in the lifetime of a graduate student. We have multiple realizations. The longest is more than 7,000 years. The slide is old. Now it's at 9,000 years. Again, a 7,000-year run takes something like 300 days, including the time. So that's about a year's production. So we don't have a lot of different. Sometimes we look at initial conditions uncertainty, and what that does, we can't do that for these very long multimillennial runs because it's hard enough to do one of them, much less do 10 of them. So we have different kind of components of the library that are aimed at solving different problems. Currently, we're over 70 terabytes of model output at this point. So once again, could not manage that without the computational facilities available here for storage. Our first strategy for the emulation was to, rather than go, one of the reasons we don't care so much about the resolution of the model is we're not even trying to emulate the response at the model grade resolution, because the smaller the resolution, the more your noise will be. So we're saying let's aggregate up to reasonable sizes, and we'll emulate the mean climate response to CO2 changes for those what we call subcontinental regions. And then we can figure out what the pattern of response is within that region and apply that if you want to find a scale projection. But this is still a very large step over how people have been doing climate model representation in human impacts models, which is that they've been scaling everything to global mean temperature, right? And we know that that can't possibly be right because the Earth warms at different rates. So scaling something to global mean temperature will never give you a long-term projection that's accurate across regions. If you actually want to look at regional impacts, you have to do something better than that. So this is our sort of function to go one step beyond what had been done before. And we had a lot of different ideas about how to do emulation. There's a lot of interest in Gaussian process models right now. And finally, Michael Stein, our amazing statistician who works on spatial temporal statistics here at the University of Chicago and is a member of RDCEP, he says, you know what, let's just try writing it down, a really simple function, and see if we can just fit its parameters. And we all said, oh, well, that can't work. You know, the climate system is much more complicated than that. How can we ever do that? And he said, well, you know, why don't we just try that first? And so this is what we did. And you know what? The climate system is not complicated enough to make this not possible. So we wrote down the temperature as a function of the past trajectory of CO2. That is, we have a couple terms here. We have the pre-industrial temperature, and then the rest of the stuff on the right-hand side is the change in that temperature. There's some function which is a response to the current CO2 anomaly. But then there's this other function which is a long-weighted response to past history. So we said the past matters. Let's just apply a weighting function that's semi-arbitrary. Here's our weighting, is the exponential weights. So the influence of the past declines over as you go further back. But we still know that those past CO2 trajectories matter. If it was only the second term, then we wouldn't even have to do this. There would be no such thing as a transient response. We would just have a climate that responds to the current CO2 levels. So this is really, really primitive. And we tried exponential weighting just because Michael said, let's try the simplest possible weighting first. Okay. Seems a little odd, but we might as well try it. So that really is 4 different parameters. And one of those is the pre-industrial temperature, which just comes straight out of the model, right? So it's the characterization of the change is only really 3 parameters of temperature. And then for precipitation, we just use a representation that is common in the literature that seems to work well. I can explain. We have a whole other talk if you want to figure out what this representation means. But again, there's a pre-industrial precipitation. There's a function of temperature. And then there's a function that appears to be a fast response to the instantaneous forcing. So that's 3 parameters in temperature, one of which is just the pre-industrial. So 7 total parameters between the mean, climate, and then I'm going to talk a little later about these epsilons at the end, which is the stochastic term, right? Because the climate has this short-term variation around its mean. So even if you have a slow change in the mean, you have a stochastic fuzz on top of that. And so we have a separate project now to do a better job of emulating those epsilon terms. In this case, we, in precip, we just modeled it as white noise, and it's for temperature as a simple A01 dependence. So these simple models turn out, in fact, to capture regional climate behavior quite well across scenarios with different training sets. We can do a pretty good job of capturing the regional response. And so here I just showed you 2 different, in this case, there's an actual model output for a given scenario is the gray fuzzy line, because that's got the real stochastic variability on it. And the red line shows the mean response of the emulated model. So I didn't give you the emulated fuzz, but I'm giving you that mean, the 7-parameter dependent mean function. And the red line was generated without any input from this actual scenario. It was generated by training the statistical model, the parameters of the statistical model, on other scenarios, other climate model runs. Then we predict what this climate model run should produce and compare it to what the model really did. And so the correspondence tells you that the emulation is sufficient for the purpose. And we have this paper that's now out in Climate with lots and lots of error analysis discussing how sufficient it really is. But if to all intents and purposes, we're emulating essentially to within the uncertainty generated by the initial conditions, uncertainty of the model run. So the drop scenario doesn't do quite so well. It's a totally unphysical scenario, but even so, we have a couple decades of glitch there in that scenario that wouldn't really happen anyway. And we decided that was okay. We don't need to be perfect in emulating. We're not capturing the extreme tails of the climate behavior. But for any sort of slow, realistic change, we're doing fine. Now, so what we did with our giant climate library that we self-generated is a nice start, but that's obviously not the purpose of climate model emulation. You don't want to just emulate a model that you already control and run. What you'd like to do is be able to apply emulation techniques to the whole mass of climate data that's out there now. So part of our experiment was to ask how small a library does emulation really require. We generated giant climate model runs in part because it's a huge 70 terabyte library, because we thought we might need a lot of that library in order to do the emulation. It turns out, as we whittle the training sets down to be smaller and smaller, we really don't need that much. You can do a pretty good job just on 2 scenarios, 1 realization each. which gave us confidence that we might be able to do reasonable things with the standard archive model output. And I said that the whole climate modeling community has a fairly transparent process right now where models are run on standard scenarios and all the output is publicly archived. Here is a figure that shows the climate forcing scenarios of the latest round of the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the AR4 report, which just came out. And all the modeling teams were asked to reproduce this set of scenarios, which is, it says they're representative concentration pathways. It's listed in radio forcing, but you can think of these as CO2 concentrations. And so the RCP 85 represents essentially business as usual until some miracle happens around 2200, because nobody wants to contemplate what happens if there's no miracle. And then the other ones are progressively more optimistic scenarios where miracles happen earlier and earlier. And, you know, somehow we all stay rich but don't produce a lot of CO2. And then the lowest one there is a geoengineering scenario where somebody figures out how to economically strip the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And they have different, the wiggles are solar forcing, and they're applied in different ways. Sometimes they'll stop having the solar cycle change abruptly. But this is a fairly smooth set of scenarios without a lot of differences in the critical period we really care about for short-term projections. And we wanted to say, well, can we use these scenarios that aren't even that different to train a model sufficiently well with a few of these to be able to predict the others? And it does work. We're actually being rather slow in writing this up. I'm going to show you a figure that was just generated by an undergraduate yesterday from some stuff. You should ignore that Canadian model and the second from the top because we grabbed the wrong scenario. But everything else is not really that bad. That model's totally fine as well. But this is just global mean temperature, and the red is the actual projection of global mean temperature, and the blue is our emulation of global mean temperature change. In this case, we are trying to do a fairly aggressive prediction. We've done a whole bunch of different tests. So we're predicting the most extreme scenario by only training the model on less extreme, on the RCP 30 and 45. And I'm just showing you GMT, but this also, we have the same, we generally work for regions as well. And you can see a few glitches which are also informative. The question of why some models fit less well than others is part of the way that we can use this emulation process to also characterize and compare models. But most models is fine. Some models this functional form does not work as well for, and that tells you something instructive. The GIST model has huge Landowschen contrast issues in the way the emulation works, and we see those Landowschen contrast issues show up in lots of other statistical characterizations. It's kind of unique among models. We don't know why that is, but to us, that's as a diagnostic of something going on with the model itself.
So you fit your model separately to each
yes, each model, we have training set for each model. We did the statistical parameters from that training set, and then we applied the prediction scenario, and then we compared it with the model that we did in that prediction scenario. And this is for GMT, but you obviously can fit each the region separately, which is mostly what we do. But then I have like 200 figures that we're in the exploration phase of, exactly. In these runs, we drop that short-term term. In all the stuff we've done with CCSM3, we have a short-term response and a weighted long-term response. In all of these, we only have a weighted long-term response because these scenarios are so smooth, you can't really distinguish a short from long-term response of the climate system. There's no differentiation that's possible. But that makes the emulation simpler. We just drop the whole parameter from